What happens when privilege meets prejudice at 35,000 feet in the hushed, exclusive world of first class? A ticket isn't always enough. For 18-year-old Zora Hayes, her seat 2A represented more than just luxury. It was a connection to the father she had just lost. But for Brenda Gable, the lead flight attendant, the sight of a young black woman in her cabin was an error that needed correcting. A battle of wills began over a simple seat, a confrontation that would ground a flight, shatter a career, and expose a secret that would rock an entire airline to its core. This isn't just a story about a seat on a plane. It's about the price of underestimation and the crushing weight of karma when it finally comes to collect. The air in the Aerovista Airlines Polaris Lounge at San Francisco International Airport hummed with a quiet, expensive energy. It was a symphony of clinking glasses, muted business calls, and the soft rustle of newspapers. For Zora Hayes, it was a sterile sanctuary, a place to be invisible before she had to step into the brightest of spotlights. At 18, she felt like an actress who had been handed the lead role in a play she'd never rehearsed in a language she barely understood. The role was heiress. The play was the rest of her life. Her father, James Hayes, had been the silent genius behind Aerovista. He wasn't the flashy CEO, the face on magazine covers. He was the engineer, the innovator, the man who designed the revolutionary composite materials that made their planes lighter, faster, and more fuel-efficient than any competitor. He was the Vista in Aerovista, and now he was gone. A sudden, cruel heart attack had stolen him 6 weeks ago, leaving a void in Zora's life so vast it felt like a physical part of her had been carved out. In his will, he had left her everything: his sprawling portfolio, his patents, and his controlling shares in the airline he had built from a blueprint and a dream. The shares came with a seat on the board. The first meeting was tomorrow in New York. This flight, Flight 88, was her reluctant chariot to a new reality. Zora was dressed simply. Tailored black trousers, a soft cashmere sweater, and comfortable but elegant loafers. Her hair was pulled back in a neat puff, showcasing the delicate lines of her face, a face that held both the exhaustion of grief and the fierce intelligence she'd inherited from her father. She clutched a worn leather portfolio to her chest. It contained her boarding pass, her ID, and a sheaf of papers that felt heavier than lead: the official shareholder certificates and the proxy appointment naming her to the board. They were her crown and her cross. When the boarding call for Flight 88 echoed through the lounge, Zora took a deep, steadying breath and joined the short, privileged line at Gate C9. She was the last to walk down the jet bridge, preferring to avoid the jostling and posturing that often came with first-class boarding. She stepped onto the plane and was immediately met with a wall of practiced charm. "Welcome aboard," said a flight attendant with blonde hair pulled into a tight, perfect chignon. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Her name tag read, Brenda. "Good morning," Zora said softly, her eyes scanning for her seat number. "May I see your boarding pass?" Brenda's voice was crisp, efficient. Zora handed it over. Brenda glanced at it, her eyes flicking from the paper to Zora's face and back again. A tiny, almost imperceptible frown line appeared between her manicured eyebrows. "Seat 2A. "Right this way," she said, her tone a fraction cooler than before. Zora walked past the first row, her gaze falling on the plush, pod-like seat that awaited her. It was a cocoon of beige leather and polished chrome. She could almost feel her father's presence here. He had obsessed over the ergonomics of these very seats for months. As she moved to place her small roller bag in the overhead bin, Brenda's voice cut through the cabin's quiet hum. "Excuse me." Ma'am Zora turned. Yes. Brenda Gable had been a lead purser with Aerovista for 22 years. She considered the first-class cabin her domain, a kingdom she ruled with an iron fist clad in a silk glove. She prided herself on her ability to spot a problem before it started. She saw the frequent flyers she knew by name, Mr. Henderson in 1B, Mrs. Albright in 3D. She saw the quiet money and the flashy new money. And in her meticulously ordered world, Zora Hayes did not compute. Young alone, dressed down and black. To Brenda, the combination screamed, "Buddy pass," upgraded on a prayer, or worse, fraud. "I'll need to see that boarding pass again," Brenda said, her voice louder now, drawing the attention of the other passengers who were settling in. Zora's brow furrowed in confusion. "I just showed it to you, and I need to see it again," Brenda insisted, holding out a perfectly manicured hand. There was a flinty hardness in her eyes that belied her professional smile. Zora retrieved the pass from her portfolio and handed it over. Brenda made a show of scrutinizing it, turning it over, checking the name. Zora Hayes. She said the name out loud, drawing it out as if it tasted strange. "I'll just need to verify this with the gate agent. There seems to be a discrepancy." Zora felt a hot flush of embarrassment creep up her neck. The other passengers were now openly staring. A man in a tailored suit in the row behind her, a Mr. David Chen, looked up from his laptop with a curious expression. A discrepancy. What kind of discrepancy? Zora asked, her voice steady, despite the tremor of humiliation she felt. Sometimes the system issues seat assignments incorrectly. We have a full manifest today, and I need to ensure all our first-class passengers are correctly seated. Brenda replied, her words dripping with implication. The message was clear. "You don't belong here." She walked briskly to the front of the cabin and spoke into the intercom. Her voice low, but her posture rigid and self-important. Zora stood awkwardly in the aisle, the focus of a dozen pairs of eyes. She wanted to shrink, to disappear. She could feel the familiar sting of being judged, of being seen as less than a feeling she'd hoped she was flying away from, not toward. Brenda returned a minute later, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips. "As I suspected, there's some confusion. It's probably best if you wait by the galley here while we sort it out. Perhaps you could show me your identification as well." This was no longer a procedural check. It was an interrogation, an accusation. "There is no confusion," Zora said, her voice finding a sudden strength. "My name is Zora Hayes. My seat is 2A. That is my boarding pass, and it is valid." "All due respect, ma'am." Brenda said, her voice losing its faux politeness and taking on a sharp, condescending edge. "I have been doing this job for over 2 decades. I know when something isn't right. Now, if you don't want to cooperate, I can have the captain come out." "Perhaps you should." Zora shot back, her patience evaporating. The memory of her father, his pride in this airline, his belief in treating every person with dignity fueled her anger. This woman was twisting everything he stood for into a weapon of petty prejudice. "Fine," Brenda snapped. She turned on her heel and disappeared toward the cockpit. The cabin was thick with uncomfortable silence. A woman in row 3 whispered to her husband, loud enough for Zora to hear. "Probably one of those influencers trying to get a viral video. It's pathetic." Zora's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She felt utterly alone. Then a calm voice spoke from the seat behind her. "Excuse me, miss. Are you all right?" It was the man who had been watching Mr. Chen. He had kind eyes and a concerned expression. "I'm fine." Zora managed, though her voice wavered. "This is absurd," he said, shaking his head. "Her behavior is completely out of line. I'm a corporate lawyer and I fly this route twice a month. I've seen this attendant Brenda before. She has a reputation for being particular." He chose his words carefully. "If you need a witness to this, you have one." "Thank you." Zora whispered, a small measure of relief washing over her. She wasn't entirely alone. The cockpit door opened and Brenda emerged, followed by a man with silvering temples and a 4-stripe epaulet on his uniform. This was Captain Frank Hollis. He looked weary, like a man who would rather be calculating fuel-to-weight ratios than settling cabin disputes. "Ma'am, I'm Captain Hollis," he said, his voice a low rumble. "My purser tells me there's some issue with your seating assignment." "There is no issue," Zora said, looking the captain directly in the eye. "Your purser has decided, for reasons I can only guess at, that I do not belong in the seat I paid for. She has publicly accused me of, I'm not even sure what, fraud." Brenda jumped in. "Captain, the ticket just seems improbable. She doesn't have any status with the airline. It was booked last minute, full fare. It's a red flag. I was simply doing my due diligence to protect the integrity of the cabin and the security of this flight." Improbable. The word hung in the air, ugly and sharp. It was code. It meant it was improbable that someone who looked like Zora could afford to be there without some catch. The captain looked from Brenda's indignant face to Zora's resolute one. He was caught in the middle, and the flight was already 5 minutes behind schedule. He sighed. "Ma'am, Miss Hayes," he said, glancing at the boarding pass Brenda was still holding like evidence. "Perhaps to resolve this quickly, we could just find you another comfortable seat in the main cabin for takeoff. We can sort out the fare difference later. I just need to get this aircraft moving." It was the easy way out, a compromise that asked everything of her and nothing of the woman who had created the problem. It was a dismissal of her right to be there. And Zora had had enough of being dismissed. The grief inside her, a quiet, deep ocean, suddenly churned into a storm. This wasn't just about a seat anymore. It was about her father. It was about his name. "No, Zora," said her voice, ringing with newfound authority. It was a voice that surprised even herself. "I will not be moving to the main cabin. I will be sitting in my assigned seat, 2A. And we will not be taking off until this is resolved to my satisfaction." Brenda scoffed, a short, sharp, ugly sound. "And who are you to be making demands?" Zora held her gaze. The timid, grieving girl was gone. In her place was the daughter of James Hayes, the inheritor of his legacy. She reached into her leather portfolio, her fingers bypassing the boarding pass and ID. They closed around the thick, formal documents nestled at the very back. "Who am I?" Zora repeated, her voice low and dangerous. "That's a very good question, and I think it's about time you all found out the answer." The atmosphere in the first-class cabin had grown heavy, charged with the kind of tension that precedes a lightning strike. Captain Hollis looked aspirated. Brenda looked smugly defiant, and the other passengers were now fully invested in the drama, their phones discreetly angled to capture the confrontation. Zora's words hung in the air, a direct challenge that silenced the whispers. She looked from Brenda's sneering face to the captain's tired one. Taking another person to another seat was a simple solution for him, a way to defuse the situation and get his plane in the air. But for Zora, it was an unacceptable surrender to bigotry. "We are not taking off." Zora repeated, her voice now devoid of any tremor. "Not until this is handled, and it won't be handled by shuffling me to the back of the plane like a piece of lost luggage." Brenda laughed a short, condescending bark. "You're in no position to be making threats, young lady. You are delaying a federal conveyance. The captain has offered you a perfectly reasonable solution." "It is not reasonable," Zora countered, "to be punished for the prejudice of your employee." She turned her full attention to Captain Hollis. "Captain, I understand you want to depart on time, but your lead purser has in front of a dozen witnesses harassed and humiliated me based on her own assumptions. She has implied I am a liar and a thief. She has refused to accept my valid ticket. Moving me is not a solution. It's an endorsement of her behavior. So no, I will not move." Mr. Chen, the lawyer in 3A, spoke up again, his voice firm and clear. "Captain, the young lady is correct. Your purser's conduct has been unprofessional and appears to be discriminatory. Forcing her to move would only compound the issue for Aerovista. I can assure you this has all the makings of a very messy and very public lawsuit." The word lawsuit seemed to land like a physical blow. The captain's posture stiffened. He shot a furious glare at Brenda, whose smugness was beginning to curdle into uncertainty. He was a pilot, not a crisis manager. "All right," the captain said, trying to regain control. Brenda returned the passenger's boarding pass. "Miss Hayes, please take your seat. We will deal with this internally." "No," Zora said again. The word was becoming her armor. "Internally is not good enough. Not anymore." She knew what internally meant. It meant a note in Brenda's file, a slap on the wrist, a corporate-mandated sensitivity training video she'd click through without watching. And next week or the week after, Brenda would do it again, to someone else who didn't have the strength or the standing to fight back. Zora thought of her father, a black man, who had navigated the predominantly white world of aerospace engineering with grace and dignity, but who had told her stories of the subtle and not-so-subtle slights he'd endured along the way. She would not let this stand. Not in the airline he built. "You asked who I am," Zora said, looking directly at Brenda. "You seem to believe I'm nobody. You've made that very clear." She took a step toward the empty seat 2A and placed her leather portfolio on it. She unzipped it with deliberate, slow movements. The other passengers leaned forward, craning their necks. But she didn't pull out the documents. Not yet. Instead, she took out her phone. Her hands were perfectly steady. She swiped through her contacts, her thumb hovering over a name for a fraction of a second before pressing it. The name read Richard Peterson, CEO, Aerovista. She pressed the speakerphone button. The cabin was so quiet that the electronic ringing tone sounded like a fire alarm. 1 ring, 2 rings. A voice powerful and slightly impatient answered. "Hello, Richard Peterson speaking." The captain's eyes widened in shock. Brenda's face went white, the color draining from it, as if a plug had been pulled. She recognized the voice instantly. Everyone who worked for Aerovista knew that voice. "Richard, it's Zora Hayes." The CEO's tone shifted instantly, becoming warm, familial, and deeply concerned. "Zora." "My goodness, I wasn't expecting to hear from you until tomorrow. Is everything all right?" "Are you on the plane?" "I am on the plane, Richard." Zora said, her voice carrying clearly through the cabin. Or I'm trying to be. I'm on Flight 88 to New York in first class. Of course. Your father's favorite route, Richard said. Listen, Zora. I am so deeply sorry for your loss. James was my best friend, the heart and soul of this company. We're all looking forward to welcoming you tomorrow to honoring him. Well, the welcome here on Flight 88 has been less than ideal. Zora said, her gaze locked on Brenda, who looked like she might faint. I'm having a bit of trouble with your lead purser. Her name is Brenda Gable. What kind of trouble? Richard's voice had lost its warmth, replaced by a cold, sharp edge. She seems to believe that my presence in first class is, and I quote, improbable, Zora explained calmly. She has refused me. My seat accused me of having a fraudulent ticket, and in front of the captain and the entire cabin tried to have me moved to economy. The captain's solution was to ask me to move to avoid a delay. There was a moment of dead heavy silence on the other end of the line. Then Richard Peterson's voice came back. No longer a voice, but a clap of thunder. What? The word exploded from the phone's tiny speaker, making several passengers flinch. Put the captain on the phone. Now! Captain Hollis, looking horrified, practically snatched the phone from Zora's hand. Mr. Peterson, sir. This is Captain Frank Hollis. Frank Richards' voice was lethally calm. What in the hell is going on in your cabin? Do you have any idea who you are speaking to? Who your purser has been harassing, sir? There was some confusion with the seating, Captain Hollis stammered. There is no confusion, Captain Richard roared. The young woman you are trying to move to economy is Zora Hayes, James Hayes's daughter. She is not just a passenger, she is my guest. She is this company's legacy, and as of the reading of her father's will, she is the single largest individual shareholder in Aerovista Airlines. She controls her father's entire founding stake. Now you tell me, Frank, do you think it's a good idea to ask your new boss to move to the back of the bus? The cabin erupted in gasped breaths. The woman who had accused Zora of being an influencer looked like she'd swallowed her tongue. Mr. Chen's eyebrows were raised in astonishment, a slow smile spreading across his face. And Brenda Gable looked as though the floor had vanished from beneath her feet. Shareholder. Largest shareholder. The words didn't compute. They were an alien language describing the end of her world. Her eyes wide with terror darted to the leather portfolio sitting on seat 2A. Zora reached over her movements, now filled with a quiet, devastating grace. She finally pulled out the thick sheaf of papers, the stock certificates embossed with the Aerovista logo, and bearing her father's name, and the legal declaration of trust passing them to her. She didn't brandish them. She simply laid them on the polished surface of the seat's console table, the crisp white paper, a stark contrast to the beige leather. Captain Hollis. Zora said, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. She had taken her phone back. I believe your CEO had an order for you. Captain Hollis, pale and sweating, turned to Brenda. His face was a mask of cold fury. The weary pilot was gone, replaced by a commander whose authority had been catastrophically undermined. Brenda, he said, his voice a low growl. Get your things. You are off this flight. Now. Captain, I was just following procedure. She pleaded, her voice a pathetic whisper. You were following your own bigotry, and you have brought shame and monumental liability upon this airline, he snarled. Security will meet you at the jet bridge. Get off my plane. Humiliation washed over Brenda in a tidal wave. With trembling hands, she unclipped her small bag from the galley locker. She couldn't look at Zora. She couldn't look at anyone. Her walk of shame down the aisle was a gauntlet of shocked and judgmental stares. The 22-year career, the petty kingdom she had guarded so fiercely, it all ended right here in the aisle she had tried to deny to Zora Hayes. As she passed seat 2A, her eyes met Zora's for a fleeting second. She saw no triumph in the young woman's face, only a profound, weary sadness. Brenda stumbled off the plane, her perfect chignon now slightly askew, a visible crack in her once impenetrable facade. Captain Hollis immediately turned to the cabin, his voice now booming with renewed authority. My deepest, most sincere apologies to all of you for the delay, and especially to you, Ms. Hayes. Your treatment was inexcusable. He then turned to the other flight attendants. Let's prepare for immediate departure. Zora finally sank into seat 2A. It was soft, comfortable, and felt like coming home. The engine began to whine, the plane pushing back from the gate. Mr. Chen leaned forward slightly. That he said with a respectful nod was incredibly well handled, Ms. Hayes. Zora offered him a small, tired smile. Call me Zora. And thank you, Mr. Chen, for speaking up. David. And it was my pleasure. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Zora looked out the window. She hadn't wanted this fight. She hadn't wanted the drama. But as she watched the ground fall away, she realized something profound. Her father had given her more than just stock certificates and a seat on the board. He had given her a voice, and she was just beginning to learn how to use it. The karma for Brenda Gable had been swift and public, but Zora had a feeling the real consequences for the airline and for herself were just beginning to unfold. The remainder of the flight to New York passed in a haze of surreal courtesy. The two other flight attendants in the first-class cabin moved around Zora with the hushed, careful reverence one might afford a temperamental deity. One of them, a younger woman named Chloe, approached with tears welling in her eyes. Ms. Hayes, she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. I am so sorry for what you went through. What Brenda did was wrong. We all knew. We all knew she could be like that. But we never... She trailed off, ashamed. Zora offered a weak, tired smile. Thank you, Chloe. It wasn't your fault. But the apology, though sincere, didn't soothe the turmoil inside her. The deference felt just as alienating as the hostility had. She was no longer a person, a passenger. She was an event, a living symbol of power that had upended the natural order of the cabin. She ate the exquisitely prepared meal without tasting it, sipped the vintage champagne that felt like ash in her mouth. She tried to read a book, but the words blurred. All she could think about was her father. What would he have said? He had despised bullies, but he had also preached grace. He believed in building things, not tearing them down. Had she honored that? Or had she just become another kind of force, one that broke people when the plane finally touched down at JFK? The jet bridge connected, and the door opened, but a senior gate agent immediately stepped on board to hold back the other passengers. Ms. Hayes, Mr. Peterson is waiting for you on the tarmac. The special treatment continued. Descending the stairs to the tarmac felt like stepping into another world. The roar of nearby engines was a stark contrast to the cabin's pressurized silence, and there, standing beside a sleek black sedan, was Richard Peterson. His usually confident, commanding posture was gone. He looked older, his face etched with a genuine, profound sorrow. He didn't offer a handshake. He moved forward and enveloped her in a gentle, fatherly hug. "Zora," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "There are no words. I feel like I've failed him. I've failed you. To have that happen in the house that James and I built. It's a stain on everything we stood for." "It's not your fault, Richard," Zora repeated, but this time she leaned into the embrace, a sliver of the daughterly affection she reserved for him, breaking through her hardened exterior. "It is my company, and therefore it is my responsibility," he insisted, pulling back to look at her. His eyes filled with a furious, protective fire. "It ends now. I promise you that. Brenda Gable's employment with Aerovista was terminated for gross misconduct before your plane even reached cruising altitude. Her access cards were deactivated, her final paycheck cancelled. She's done. But that's not enough. This is deeper than one rotten employee." That night in the sterile luxury of her suite at the peninsula, Zora couldn't sleep. The city lights glittered below a galaxy of human ambition, but she felt utterly alone. The next morning she would walk into that boardroom, a room her father had commanded with his quiet genius, and she would be an imposter, a girl playing dress-up, known only for a dramatic confrontation on an airplane. She paced the floor, the plush carpet silencing her footsteps. She replayed the incident. Brenda's sneer, the captain's weary compromise, her own surge of defiant anger. Richard was right. Firing Brenda wasn't enough. It was like pulling a single weed and ignoring the poisoned soil it grew in. A new training program. An oversight committee. Those were just corporate band-aids. They didn't address the root cause, a culture that allowed a woman like Brenda to flourish for 22 years. Her eyes fell on her leather portfolio where the shareholder documents lay. Her father hadn't left her a weapon. He had left her a tool. He had been a builder. Frustration and grief churned within her, and out of that emotional vortex, an idea began to form. It started as a flicker and grew into a steady flame. She sat at the hotel desk and began to write not a speech, but a blueprint. She would not walk into that boardroom to complain. She would walk in with a plan to build. The next morning, the Aerovista boardroom felt like a tomb. The long mahogany table reflected the grim faces of the dozen board members, all older, all white, all men, who had known her father for years. They rose respectfully as she entered with Richard, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity, curiosity, and a new, wary apprehension. The story of Flight 88 had ripped through the corporate world. They weren't just looking at James Hayes's grieving child. They were looking at the airline's largest shareholder, an unknown quantity, who had already proven to be a catalyst for chaos. Zora took her designated seat, the simple brass nameplate, James Hayes. A painful reminder of the man who should have been there. Richard began the meeting, his voice devoid of its usual booming enthusiasm. "Before we address the quarterly earnings, we must address the catastrophic failure that occurred yesterday on Flight 88. What happened to Zora was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a systemic failure, a cancer of complacency and prejudice that we as a board have clearly allowed to fester in the dark. It stops today." He outlined his plan, the mandatory DEI overhaul, the Independent Review Committee, a public apology. It was a solid, if predictable, corporate response. As he finished, all eyes turned to Zora. They expected a quiet nod of approval, a few tearful words. Instead, Zora sat up straighter, pushed a stray curl from her face, and met their gazes one by one. "Thank you, Richard," she began, her voice resonating with a clarity that belied her age. Your plan is a necessary start, but policies and committees are reactive. They are designed to punish failure, not to engineer success. My father didn't just invent new alloys to make planes stronger. He believed in building a company that lifted people up. He believed the name Aerovista should be synonymous with excellence in all things, and that includes excellence in how we treat every single person who steps onto our planes. She slid a professionally printed proposal from her portfolio and pushed copies down the table. My experience yesterday was ugly and humiliating, but my pain is not the point. The point is the opportunity this incident provides. We can't just react to the bad. We must be proactive in creating the good. She let them read for a moment before continuing. I propose the creation of the James Hayes Memorial Scholarship Fund, a multi-million-dollar endowment seeded from this year's profits, dedicated to supporting underprivileged students of color in their pursuit of careers in aerospace engineering, aviation management, and business. Furthermore, I propose a mandatory mentorship program, pairing every single executive in this company, including everyone at this table, with one of those students. We will not just give them money. We will give them access guidance and a seat at the table. She paused, letting her words sink in. We need to change who we are from the ground up. We need to ensure that the faces in our cockpits, in our executive suites, and one day in this very boardroom are as diverse as the world we serve. That is how we fix the poisoned soil. That is how we honor my father's legacy. The room was utterly silent. The board members stared not at a grieving girl, but at a visionary. She had taken their PR nightmare and transformed it into a foundational mission. She hadn't just claimed her seat. She had defined her power. An old gruff board member named Harrison, a man who had often clashed with her father's more idealistic notions, cleared his throat. It's a bold plan, Zora, he said, a slow nod of admiration on his face. It's what James would have done. The consensus was unanimous. Meanwhile, in a sterile, windowless HR office at SFO, Brenda Gable's world was imploding. The official termination was delivered by a stony-faced HR executive and the head of corporate security. I don't understand, Brenda stammered, clutching her purse. It was a misunderstanding. I was protecting the company's assets. You were a liability, the HR executive said, her voice flat. You violated multiple sections of your employment contract, including insubordination to the captain and gross misconduct resulting in a flight delay and significant brand damage. Your employment is terminated effective immediately. Her first call was to her union representative, a man named Sal, she'd paid dues to for 22 years. She expected outrage on her behalf, a promise to fight. What she got was weary resignation. Brenda, I've seen the report, Sal said, a sigh heavy on the line. There's nothing to defend here. You were given a direct order by the captain to seat the passenger, and you refused. That alone is grounds for immediate termination. Add in the fact that you delayed the flight, and the passenger in question was, well, you know who she was. The union can't touch this. Our hands are tied. But she didn't look right, Brenda shrieked, her voice cracking. I was just doing my job. No Brenda. Sal said, his patience gone. You were playing gatekeeper, and you picked a fight with the one person who owns the gate. I'm sorry. There's nothing we can do. The final nail was hammered in by Aerovista's legal department. Tasked by Richard to leave no stone unturned, a young paralegal ran a search on Brenda's employee file for flagged complaints. The initial search found nothing, but digging deeper into archived digital records, he found them. 7 formal passenger complaints over the past decade, all filed against her for rude and aggressive behavior. All 7 had been filed by passengers of color. They had been handled internally and filed away. The pattern now laid bare on a spreadsheet was undeniable and damning. She wasn't just an employee who made one mistake. She was a serial offender who had finally been caught. Within hours, her name was unofficially but effectively blacklisted across the industry. Desperate, facing financial ruin and public disgrace, Brenda found her way to the office of Kenji Tanaka, a lawyer whose billboard promised aggressive representation for the wrongfully terminated. Tanaka, a man with teeth that were too white and a suit that was too shiny, listened to Brenda's tearful, self-serving version of events. He didn't see a problematic employee. He saw an opportunity. He saw a David and Goliath story he could sell. "This is outrageous," Tanaka said, his voice oozing a synthetic empathy. "You, a hard-working, blue-collar woman, being crushed by a billionaire heiress. This isn't about a seat on a plane, Brenda. This is about class. This is about privilege. This is about the elites trying to silence the common person." He fed her a narrative, and Brenda, starving for validation, devoured it. He wasn't just a lawyer. He was her savior. "We won't just sue for wrongful termination," Tanaka declared, leaning over his desk, his eyes gleaming. "We'll sue her personally for emotional distress, and we'll take our story to the media. We will make you the victim. We'll start a GoFundMe. By the time we're done, you'll be a hero, and Zora Hayes will be the villain." Clinging to this lifeline, Brenda agreed to everything. The lawsuit was filed. The battle lines were drawn. She had no idea she was not gearing up for a war, but for her own public execution. The lawsuit filed by the slick and media-savvy lawyer Kenji Tanaka was a declaration of war. It was followed by a meticulously orchestrated media campaign designed to recast Brenda Gable not as the aggressor, but as the quintessential victim. Her first move was an appearance on an incendiary online talk show, The People's Megaphone, hosted by a man who had built a career on railing against elites and woke corporations. Brenda, dressed in a soft, matronly sweater, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue as she spun her tale of woe. "I gave 22 years of my life to that airline," she said, her voice trembling with practiced fragility. "I followed every procedure, every security protocol. My only concern was for the safety and integrity of my flight." She leaned closer to the camera, her expression one of deep sincerity. "All I did was ask to verify a ticket that seemed unusual, and for that a spoiled, power-drunk teenager had me thrown away like trash. She used her family's name to ruin my life. Is this the America we live in now, where hardworking people can be cancelled in an instant?" The narrative was potent. Her GoFundMe campaign. Justice for Brenda Gable surged. Donations poured in from people across the country who saw her as a martyr in a culture war, a hero standing up to the entitled billionaire class. For a fleeting, intoxicating moment, Brenda felt vindicated. She wasn't a bigot. She was a warrior. The checks from Tanaka's office to media consultants seemed like a worthy investment. She was no longer just Brenda, the disgraced flight attendant. She was a symbol. The hope she felt was a fragile, brittle thing, but it was hope nonetheless. She truly believed she could win. In his quiet, minimalist office overlooking the San Francisco Bay, David Chen scrolled through the news articles, his jaw tightening with each fabricated quote. He watched the clip from The People's Megaphone, his professional calm giving way to a cold, rising anger. He had been there. He had seen the sneer on Brenda's face, heard the ugly implication in the word improbable. He had witnessed Zora's quiet dignity in the face of public humiliation. Brenda's performance was a masterful work of fiction, and it was working. This wasn't just a lie. It was a perversion of justice, an attempt to profit from the very prejudice he had witnessed. His duty as an officer of the court felt inextricably linked to his responsibility as a human being. He could not, in good conscience, allow this narrative to stand unchallenged. His first call was to Aerovista's general counsel. "My name is David Chen." He began, his voice level and firm. "I was a passenger in seat 3A on Flight 88. I am a partner at Chen Wexler and Park, and I saw everything. Your former employee's public statements are not just misleading. They are demonstrably false and constitute a malicious act of defamation. I am prepared to give a sworn affidavit detailing the entire incident, and if necessary, I will testify in open court." The relief on the other end of the line was palpable. But David knew a legal defense behind closed doors wasn't enough. Brenda had taken this to the court of public opinion, and it was there that the truth needed to be heard. He hung up the phone, opened a blank document on his computer, and began to write. He chose his words with the precision of a surgeon laying out the facts, not with passion, but with irrefutable clarity. He detailed the sequence of events from Brenda's initial dismissive glance to her final desperate plea to the captain. He addressed her central claim head-on. "This was not cancel culture," he wrote, the words flowing from a place of deep conviction. "I witnessed an abuse of power by a uniformed employee against a customer. The fact that the customer turned out to be a majority shareholder is a twist of fate. But it does not change the initial offense. Ms. Gable was not fired for asking for ID. She was fired for her relentless, baseless harassment of a passenger and for bringing the airline to the brink of a major discrimination lawsuit. Her current campaign is a cynical and fraudulent attempt to monetize her own bigotry." He submitted the column to a leading national newspaper. It was published the next day. The effect was like a dam breaking. David's column, coming from a respected and impartial witness, was the objective truth that shattered Brenda's fiction. The story pivoted instantly. The hashtag Justice for Brenda was drowned out by Justice for Zora. Brenda was at home watching her GoFundMe total climb past $50,000 when the first email alert from the platform arrived. "Your campaign is under review." A few minutes later, another "Your campaign has been suspended." She frantically refreshed the page. The total was no longer climbing. It was plummeting. 40,000. 20,000. 5,000. GoFundMe. Citing fraudulent misrepresentation in light of David Chen's public statement, was proactively refunding every dollar. The symbol of her resistance was dissolving into a monument of her deceit. Then the phone started ringing. It was no longer sympathetic talk show producers. It was investigative reporters. "Ms. Gable, this is Sarah Jensen from the Aviation Journal. I'm calling about a passenger complaint filed against you in 2021 by a Mrs. Rodriguez on a flight to Miami. She also claimed you tried to have her family removed from their paid-for seats. Do you have a comment?" "Ms. Gable, I'm with ProPublica. We've uncovered 7 prior complaints of discriminatory behavior. Can you explain why all 7 were filed by passengers of color?" She slammed the phone down, her heart hammering against her ribs. The past she thought was buried was being exhumed. The final devastating blow came that evening. On a major cable news network, as part of a segment on corporate responsibility, they aired a piece about the Aerovista incident. And there it was, grainy, silent, but unmistakable security footage from 2 years prior. It showed Brenda at a boarding gate, her face contorted in anger, jabbing her finger at a black family, her posture radiating the same arrogant authority she had tried to wield against Zora. She stared at the screen, watching her own forgotten ugliness play out for millions. The carefully constructed facade of the gentle, wronged victim crumbled into dust. She was seeing herself as Zora must have seen her, as the world now saw her. The next morning, Kenji Tanaka called. His voice, once so full of bluster and confidence, was now cold and clinical. "Brenda, I'm afraid our position has become untenable," he said flatly. "The new evidence, Mr. Chen's testimony, it's insurmountable. Continuing this lawsuit would be an act of professional malpractice on my part." "You can't," she shrieked, panic clawing at her throat. "You said we had a case. We had a narrative," he corrected her. "That narrative has been obliterated by facts. I'm officially withdrawing as your counsel. You'll receive my final invoice for services rendered. I wish you the best." The line went dead. Her lawsuit against Zora and Aerovista was dead, but the consequences were not. Richard Peterson, in consultation with a resolute Zora, made a final decisive move. This wasn't about revenge. It was about principle. It was about ensuring that no employee ever again thought they could profit from prejudice. They filed a countersuit against Brenda Gable for defamation and the recovery of all legal fees incurred defending against her frivolous claim. The financial ruin was swift and total. Stripped of her career, her reputation, and her lawyer Brenda had no means to fight back. The settlement was a foregone conclusion. The comfortable house in the suburbs, the monument to her 22 years of service, was sold to cover the legal judgment. The woman who once prided herself on her impeccable appearance and her dominion over the most exclusive real estate in the sky found herself renting a cramped apartment above a laundromat and working the night shift cleaning office buildings. In the anonymous quiet of the late hours, pushing a mop across endless floors, she was treated with an indifference she had once perfected as a weapon. The hard karma had finally collected its debt, leaving her with nothing but the crushing weight of her choices. 1 year later, Zora Hayes looked out the window from seat 2A on Flight 88 to New York. The clouds below were a soft, unbroken sea of white. On the polished console beside her, her tablet displayed the glowing quarterly report of the James Hayes Memorial Scholarship Fund. 20 brilliant students, future pilots, engineers, and executives had just completed their first year. Their progress tracked in a mentorship program that was already being called a model for the industry. She was now the vice chair of the Aerovista board. The title felt natural earned. The DEI committee she co-chaired with David Chen, whom she had successfully recruited as the airline's chief ethics advisor, had transformed the company's internal culture from one of reactive damage control to one of proactive inclusion. Richard Peterson often remarked that Brenda Gable's hateful act was the best thing that ever happened to Aerovista. It had exposed a weakness, and in healing it, they had become stronger, better, and more trusted than ever. Zora leaned her head back against the soft leather. She was not the same person who had sat in this seat a year ago, clutching her father's papers like a shield. The grief for him was still there, a gentle ache where a raw wound had been, but it was now intertwined with a profound sense of purpose. The confrontation with Brenda had been a crucible. It could have defined her as a victim. Instead, she had chosen to let it define her as a leader. She had inherited her father's name and his fortune, but she had earned his legacy. As the plane began its smooth descent toward the glittering skyline of Manhattan, Zora felt a quiet, settled peace. This seat was no longer just a luxury. It was her command post, a symbol of a battle she hadn't sought but had decisively won, and a window to the boundless future she was determined to build. So what does this story truly teach us? It shows that prejudice, no matter how professionally it's disguised, carries a heavy price. Brenda Gable's story is a stark reminder that the world has a way of balancing the scales. The power she abused became the instrument of her downfall, a classic case of karma delivered with pinpoint accuracy. But the real lesson lies with Zora Hayes. She transformed a moment of personal humiliation into a catalyst for sweeping positive change, honoring her father's legacy in the most powerful way imaginable. She proves that true power isn't about the seat you occupy, but the principles you stand for. What did you think of Brenda's karma? Was it deserved? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We all have stories of being underestimated. Share yours. And if you found this story as compelling as we did, please hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories of drama justice and the moment everything changes. Thank you for listening.